Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to another RCBB seminar. It's my honour to introduce Chris Armitage today, who's Professor of Health Psychology at the University of Manchester, and moved there 18 months ago, as I understand, after 12 years at the University of Sheffield, which is where Chris and I became acquainted. Chris does a number of very interesting research topics, which all generally seem to be linked together by the idea of behaviour change, trying to improve the general population's health behaviours. And today, Chris is going to come and talk to us a bit about behaviour change and sort of some of the tools that are inside the health psychologist's toolbox.
Great, thank you very much for the invitation. As Dave said, I'm going to talk about behaviour change. Hopefully, to some extent, I'm preaching to the converted, but just to emphasise the point that behaviour change is incredibly important. Why psychological intervention is important in relation to behaviour change, and some of the fundamental problems associated with behaviour change. I'm then going to talk about two kinds of psychological intervention, and just to emphasise, these are two techniques among about 90 odd different techniques. So this is a sort of tip of the iceberg in terms of behaviour change techniques. And then I'm going to draw some general conclusions from it. So, why is the scientific study of behaviour change important? Well, it's estimated that 40 to 70% of mortality is directly attributable to behavioural factors. And by behavioural factors, we mean things like smoking, excess alcohol consumption, poor dietary intake, sedentary behaviours. There's a whole variety of other behaviours. And you can think about the ways in which governments organise themselves, the way in which people regulate the sale of alcohol, a variety of different behaviours at very different levels. So we can think of behaviour in terms of patients or the general population, but we can also think of it in terms of governments and policymakers. So if it looks from that perspective, behaviour change is incredibly important. Now, the problem is that there's this pervasive view that changing behaviour is relatively straightforward. And one of the most straightforward behaviours in my mind is sort of doing as you're told. So you feel ill, you go and see a nice person who's appropriately qualified, who tells you what's wrong with you. They tell you what you need to do to make yourself well again. They give you a means of doing that, so they give you a script to take to a pharmacy. You go to the nice pharmacist, who then gives you the medication along with detailed instructions on how to take it, and you get well again. I mean, it's incredibly straightforward. So you've recognised that you're ill, which is a barrier in itself. You've made an appointment with a GP, say, which is a barrier in itself. You've got to the GP. Even once you get to the GP, there's a probability that you're not actually going to take your script to the pharmacy. And in fact, the estimate is that 20 to 30% of medication prescriptions are never cashed. Okay? So even the people that have gone through that long training have fallen at that hurdle. Even when people do cash their prescriptions, 50% of them don't take them appropriately, or don't take them in line with the recommendations. Now, if you extrapolate that to behaviours such as smoking, alcohol consumption, dietary intake, physical activity, where there's a degree of fuzziness, if you're ill and go to the doctor who tells you what to do, that's incredibly clear-cut in my mind. But if you're kind of a bit physically active, or kind of eat fruit occasionally, or kind of only smoke occasionally, then there's a fuzziness there. And so actually the scientific study of behaviour change is incredibly important. And increasingly, the world of pharmacies is waking up to the idea that actually it's not new drugs that we need, it's an ability to get people to take the drugs that we currently have. And that's where they're starting to put their resources. So, there's that pervasive sort of common sense view to behaviour change, that you simply tell people what to do and that people will acquiesce and then we can all go home. And clearly that's not the case. I'm going to give a couple more examples of where common sense doesn't really work. And I'm going to pick on, sounds awful, British Heart Foundation campaign a few years ago, designed to increase treatment seeking in men suffering acute myocardial infarction. It's, we'll say, men of a certain age, experiencing chest pains. The quicker you can get to an accident and emergency unit, the better your chances of survival are. The less likely you are to be a further drain on resources. So the British Heart Foundation carried out a large-scale media campaign in 2006 to 2007, and it looked something like this. It might be familiar, might not be familiar, but it's really clear. The message couldn't be clearer. Chest pain is your body saying call 999. There's branding here, recognisable, British Heart Foundation, down kills, call 999 immediately. I wouldn't want this to happen to me. This looks terrifyingly scary. There's a belt tightening around this man's chest. It doesn't look well at all. Okay? So it looks incredibly plausible. If I get a chest pain, then boy, am I calling 999. However, if you analyse the data, what you find is that the red line shows changes in hospital admissions over the course of the period of the campaign. And the red line, hospital admissions for acute myocardial infarction. And in fact, there's very little change over the period of the campaign. What you do see, though, is a spike in admissions for hypertension. Now, hypertension, rightly, is regarded as a serious medical condition, but it doesn't need accident and emergency attendance. It's a very costly way of dealing with hypertension, and you can deal with that in secondary care. There are all sorts of ways you deal with hypertension, but you don't need accident and emergency treatment. In other words, there are unintended consequences of what was a very widespread campaign. So it wasn't just posters, it was TV adverts, radio spots, the whole lot. But it had these unanticipated consequences, largely due to a common sense approach to trying to change people's behaviour. Here's another approach. People smoke cigarettes, perfectly fine, but it's not desperately good for them. And in 2008, over a period of years, they sort of got to the point where the warning messages on cigarette packages looked like something like this. Very, very clear, black and white. It took up 2/3 of the packet. There were very specific proportions of space that it should take up. And this has grown over the years. In the old days, doctors used to recommend certain kinds of cigarettes, and certainly when I used to smoke, it was the best thing you could possibly do. It was great for your lungs. But anyway, over time we learned that this wasn't necessarily such a great idea, and so we get warning labels like this. But people continue to smoke. Why do people continue to smoke? People continue to smoke because they're stupid. In other words, you don't get the message that smoking clogs the arteries and causes heart attacks. And so, because these smokers are so stupid, you need to beat them over the head with graphic images like this. This is horrendous. I don't even know what part of the body this is. It's probably the heart, isn't it? It's the heart. Okay, so it's the heart. I wouldn't want this to happen to me, and therefore I must stop smoking immediately. But of course, smokers are not stupid. Turns out smokers are not at all stupid, and in fact what you find is that over the period where they changed from just the warning label to warning label plus graphic image, smokers were less inclined to quit smoking. Okay? So this common sense approach, this idea, and forgive me, it's really plausible. If people aren't getting the message, just make it a bit more graphic. Make it a bit clearer for people. Intuitively, that kind of makes sense. Empirically, scientifically, it makes very little sense at all. And actually what you're doing is you're pushing smokers away from quitting, in this case. And I could go on about this all day, but loads of great examples of this. I'll move on though. But common sense only gets you so far in terms of changing behaviour. The one law of behaviour change is of unintended consequences. Okay, so try and stop banging on about it. A lot of behaviour change research is characterised by these common sense approaches, by non-experimental designs, lack of theoretical underpinning. If you introduce a graphic label, theoretically, what are you trying to do to people? There's a lack of interest in the process of behaviour change. What are those key variables? What are those key triggers that move people along a behaviour change continuum? And there's also this blunderbuss approach. So the British Heart Foundation, as I said, there are radio spots, t-shirts, fridge magnets, there's billboard campaigns of numerous different kinds. It was on the TV, it was on the web, all sorts of different ways. And of course, you've no idea, well, we've an idea that it didn't work at all, or in fact backfired, but we've no idea why it backfired. Was it the fridge magnets? Was it a fridge magnet too far? Okay? So, with this blunderbuss approach, you can't identify unique levers that will change people's behaviour. And so my argument is that theory-driven research using experimental designs is likely to maximise behaviour change as well as to contribute to understanding of human behaviour. So I'm going to talk today about a broad theoretical framework called the Rubicon model, which might or might not be familiar to some of you. Very briefly, it describes two phases of human action. And what it posits, and what I've drawn from this, are two fundamental problems in behaviour change. The first one is to do with motivating people. So there is a subset of the population, and in all the studies we've done, it's a relatively small population, but there's a population who need motivating. So they need scaring, they need information, they lack motivation to change their behaviour. And that's fine. You need one set of tools for changing that kind of person. Second, the majority of people actually are quite motivated to change their behaviour. They know what they need to do to change their behaviour. And actually the big problem there is ensuring that the motivation is translated into action. And that's the bigger problem. And from a public health perspective, targeting those people who are already motivated is going to have a much bigger impact. So, I'm going to talk about these two problems in behaviour change. The motivational problem, and I'll talk about the volitional problem, this idea of translating already good intentions into action. Okay? I'm going to talk about some ongoing work in these domains and some future areas that we're working on. And I'm going to pick out two particular techniques in particular. I'm going to talk about self-affirmation and implementation intentions. As I said, there are 90 odd other behaviour change techniques I could be talking about that slot into these two ideas of affecting people's motivation and ensuring motivation gets translated into action. Now, I'm going to talk about a load of studies, so I'm not going to go into finite detail about each of the studies. I'll give you the broad perspective of where these people come from. If anybody wants to ask specific questions about specific populations or measurement or any of those other kinds of things, I'll pick up those questions at the end. But I want to give a broad brush of the kind of work that we've been doing in these areas of motivation and volition. What I will say though is that the samples that we use are broadly representative general population or at-risk samples. We don't conduct research on students. We randomise people to conditions, very fundamental scientific principle. We use intention to treat analysis. If people drop out of our studies, then we assume that they haven't changed at all. Now, there's lots of controversy about this particular technique, and actually, if anything, it underestimates the extent to which behaviour change has occurred. So, in my view, that's quite a good thing. Theoretical basis to the interventions and to our secondary outcome measures. So, we're interested not just outcome, but also process. We activate a unique behaviour change technique within a single study, and this is incredibly important. Because even giving someone a leaflet might be changing 3 or 4 different psychological constructs, and we're trying to isolate those unique ingredients and change people's behaviour. We're doing a systematic review of goal setting at the minute. I want to get an audience perspective on this. Okay, so goal setting. Right, the idea of setting a goal to change people's behaviour seems incredibly straightforward. Anybody want to suggest how many papers we found that manipulate just goal setting versus a control condition? So in the whole of psychology, not none, but when I last asked this question, somebody said 3,000. So if you think of all organisational psychology, occupational psychology, the idea of setting goals, educational psychology, we found 20 studies. Thanks for saying 0. But very few. Very few. And that's such a fundamental, obvious thing to do. It's whenever anybody sits down with someone trying to change their behaviour, the first thing they do is set a goal. But they also do all kinds of other stuff as well. So anyway, and we deliver them at arm's length. We deliver things at arm's length to try and take the person out of the equation. The idea being that we are trying to test these unique drivers of behaviour, these unique behaviour change techniques, and we're stripping the person out of the equation. What we do is we deliver them at arm's length. In the old days, this would be stapling self-completion exercises to people's pay slips. That went out the window with electronic pay slips. But we delivered them via magazines, by internal mail, by online means. We do it at arm's length, because if the experimenter's there are experimentary experiments. And so what we imagine is that if we very good sneeze, by the way. That if we bring the person back into the equation, all those things about face-to-face contact, rapport, all those things will only augment the kinds of things that we're doing. So, I'm to start with the motivational side of the equation. And of course, a way of motivating people is to provide them with scary messages. Provide them with images that are graphic, images that you're going to say, oh, I really don't want that to happen to me. And the problem with that is that we have a theory about why people aren't persuaded by scary messages, known as self-affirmation theory. And very briefly, what the theory states is that people aren't motivated by scary messages because they perceive the messages as threatening. And if you perceive something as threatening, your reaction is to push against it. In the context of a health risk message, that means you're going to ignore it, you're going to slag it off, you're going to derogate it, you're going to, in other words, any persuasive message that you perceive as threatening is not going to have an impact. And perhaps that explains the earlier slide where I showed that smokers were less likely to want to quit than having been further threatened. Now, according to the theory, we're motivated to maintain a positive sense of self, a very global sort of sense of self. And what this means is that by affirming in a domain other than that in which you're threatened with, should bolster your sense of self and make you better able to cope with a threatening health message. So here's one view of the sense of self. So if we imagine the sense of self as, say, a rubber ball or something like that, made up of all different kinds of segments. So we derive our sense of self from things like our personality, our friendships, our activities, our body shape and weight, our competence, a variety of things that make up our sense of self. And if we threaten one of those domains, then we're likely to push against it. However, if we compensate, if we self-affirm in a different domain, then it means that we're better able to cope with whatever the threatening message is. So the theory goes something like this. Being exposed to risk information increases perceived threat. If we feel threatened, we engage in defensive processing. We push messages away from us, we slag them off, we derogate them, we say they don't apply to us. So, logically, defensive processing undermines the potency of any risk information. But by affirming in a domain other than that which we're being targeted at, is sufficient to compensate for that perception of threat and helps us overcome feelings of threat, which should help us process the information better and should therefore lead to further behaviour change. So we did this in a study. I said I wasn't going to talk too much about samples. This sample's a notable one. These were career smokers, I would describe them as. They were night shift, sweet packing factory, really super keen on smoking, really not at all keen on quitting smoking. The kind of people that are just not at all interested in NHS health messages or any of that kind of thing. And so what we did was we exposed them to a standard health risk quit smoking message, and we randomised them to complete a self-affirming exercise or to a control condition. This is what the message looked like. Very brief, very standard kind of message. This shows you all the bits of the body that will fall off if you continue smoking. So what happened? We gave people a self-affirming exercise to undertake versus a control condition. And what we found was that even in this group of people who were really desperately not interested in quitting, were able to significantly boost their motivation simply by getting them to complete a self-affirming exercise. Now, self-affirming exercise was actually a questionnaire where we asked them to recall acts of kindness. The idea being that reminding people that they're kind, moral, adaptable people helps them cope with the threat of the health message, and we're able to boost people's motivation. What we're also able to do is surreptitiously watch whether people took further advice about quitting smoking. So we left leaflets on a table and we surreptitiously coded whether people took them. And in our self-affirmation condition, our experimental condition, significantly more people took further information. So we have an objective measure of message acceptance. In other words, people who weren't likely to take any kind of information before were more likely to do so afterwards. So clearly, there's some evidence for this helping people to process threatening information and how it might help overcome those defensive processes. So the question was, can we sustain these effects over the longer term and in another domain? So we did a very similar kind of exercise. This was a general population this time, wasn't particularly selected for any particular reason, just a general, regular population. And in this case, we were interested in getting people to reduce their alcohol consumption. And we got very, very similar effects. By getting people to self-affirm, boost their motivation to drink less alcohol compared to a control condition. We also got them to derogate the message less. So we took a direct measure of message derogation, and we found that by getting people to self-affirm, they were more positive about the message, they were less likely to slag it off. Our objective measure of message acceptance, again, this surreptitious measure of them taking more information about the particular health problem. Again, more people in our self-affirming condition took further information. And crucially, at follow-up, controlling for baseline, significantly lower levels of alcohol consumed in follow-up, to the extent of almost 1.5 units per day. In public health terms, a staggering amount. This is best part of 10 units per week. This is a staggering amount if you bear in mind the kinds of limits of the government recommendations. So recently replicated this among adolescent populations. So it also works in adolescents. So adolescents, again, developing their sense of self, developing the foundations of what they believe to be moral and adaptable kind of thing. But it also works in this population as well. They're drinking less to start with. We managed to significantly reduce their alcohol consumption further. Again, by using a relatively simple, arm's length, brief self-completion exercise designed to get them to self-affirm. Also done it in body satisfaction. So these adolescent girls, clearly one area that adolescent girls derive their sense of self from is from body shape and weight. What we were able to do is shift their perceptions of where they get their sense of self from away from body shape and weight and towards more adaptable things like competence at activities outside school, competence at activities in school, their own personality, their friendship groups and things like that. And so we were able to actually reduce their levels of body dissatisfaction compared to the control group. More recently, we've been looking at end-stage renal failure. Again, I don't really want to talk too much about populations. End-stage renal failure patients have to take something like 19 separate medications per day. This is a really tough regime to stick to. On top of that, they're allowed to drink about that much water per day. Very, very restricted liquid intake. Very, very tough regime. And of course, you should see the amount of information they're bombarded with about these 19 separate medications. Of course, they're bombarded with information, it's incredibly threatening, and what we were able to do was boost their adherence to phosphate binders and actually reduce their serum phosphate levels in the experimental group compared to the control group. And this is over a 12-month period. So objective effects on a biomarker of these attempts to help people process information more efficiently. So, very brief tour of self-affirmation research, a way of helping people overcome defensive processing. And there's a load of research that we're doing at the minute. It's a relatively new area for us. And we have a few questions to work on at the minute. So, which self-affirmation interventions work best in which context? There are a number of ways, as you can imagine, of affirming yourself, of making people feel moral and adaptable. And we're exploring different ways, different techniques. American undergraduates, the standard way of doing it is to get them to write an essay. You can't get the night shift in a factory to write essays. And I would know because we tried. Okay? You can't do that. So we're exploring different, more efficient means of getting people to self-affirm. What are the variables that mediate the effect? We've got some mediation, but we haven't got full mediation. We're not entirely clear what factors mediate the effect. We have these, I was talking to Fari Marlon, whose PhD the serum phosphate data are based on. We have another study, 12 months follow-up, objective biomarker again, have significant effects of self-affirmation, but very little in terms of mediation, in terms of changes in perceived threat, changes in message processing and things like that. So we're really working, the next step is really to work out hard to find out, what the mechanisms are by which it's working. And I think we're going to have to really develop the theory a little bit further to understand exactly what's going on. And then, can the effects be sustained in the longer term? We've had effects up to 12 months. Other labs have had effects up to 2 years. It'd be valuable to see if these sustain in the even longer term. Okay, so that's self-affirmation. It's an interesting idea. It's kind of counterintuitive, but it seems to have powerful effects on behaviour, even if we don't fully yet understand psychological processes. But of course, that's all the more interesting in a sense. So that's the motivational side of the equation. We're able to pretty much boost people's motivation, and we're able to change their behaviour. But as I said right at the outset, actually it's quite often the case that people don't lack motivation. We know, for example, that about 70% of smokers want to quit, but 60% of adults want to lose weight. In every study I've ever done, most people want, intend, plan to change their behaviour. Most people feel confident they can do it, and most people, they have sufficient resources, skills and knowledge to be able to do it. And yet the only game in town seems to be educating people or scaring them. And so the argument is that what we need to be doing is focusing on, or assuming that on a public health level, the majority of people are likely to be motivated to change their behaviour. And that it's actually translating that motivation into behaviour that's crucial to changing their behaviour. So I'm going to give a few very, very quick examples of motivation to lose weight. Motivation to lose weight is really, really interesting, because what quite often happens is that weight treatment programs are all geared around motivating people. So there's motivational interviewing, there's goal setting, there's feedback, there's the weigh people, very much off the record between these four walls. At some commercial weight loss programs, they have a little pigsty, where women that haven't lost weight go in there and they get oinked at by the other women. How lovely is that? And people are paying to do this, okay? People are paying to do this to be oinked at. British Dietetic Association, I'm not sure if it's still up there, picture on their website, pig with a tape measure around it. This is the level to which we've descended. And yet, these people are turning up week by week. They're paying for the privilege of this. What further motivation could they need? So we've done a few studies with people trying to lose weight. This is a bit of a busy slide. This tells the story. The blue bits show you how motivated these people are. The red bits show you how much more motivated they need to be. And at some point, I'm going to pull my finger out and do this across all the studies we've ever done, but the picture would be pretty much the same. Physical activity, smoking cessation, alcohol consumption, attendance at screening. My bet is that the picture is identical across all those different kinds of health behaviours. Pretty much, people are motivated. Most smokers want to quit. Most people who are overweight want to lose weight, and it's not about repeatedly giving the same message over and over again. So what can we do? Okay, so one of the problems that we have is that we're often creatures of habit, and I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that this demonstration is going to work. I'm going to set you a problem, okay? And what I want you to do is to yell out the thing that's at the top of your mind when I have to set this problem. It's not incredibly difficult, it's a relatively simple answer. I just want to give you the first thing that comes into your mind, okay? Shout it out loud, we're all friends here, okay? So, if it takes 2 men 2 days to dig 2 holes, how many days does it take 1 man to dig 1 hole?
2.
But first of all, apart from the people here, that was horribly slow. Horribly slow. The correct answer, and I have to write this down, I'm going to check this, the correct answer is actually 2. But whose brain screamed at them, and be honest here, whose brain screamed at them 1? The rest of you are lying, I'm sorry. I so want to say 1 to this, but I have to double check. Okay, I have to double check. Why do I have to double check? Because my brain doesn't like me very much. Because there are automatic processes going on that are far better at ruling my life than I am. Okay? And it screams at me 1 every single time. I have to check every single time. Okay, I'm going to get it wrong one of these days, in fact. But the truth is that we've evolved to become creatures of habit because, frankly, it makes everything a heck of a lot easier. And once you assume that, then actually the problem shifts from sort of bullying people into changing their behaviour more towards Well, okay, let's work with this level of automaticity. Now, we have a tool for affecting people's automaticity known as implementation intentions. And there are decades worth of laboratory experiments of usually American undergraduates sat in labs, pushing buttons, identifying the basic mechanisms of this process. What happens is, implementation intentions are very specific forms of planning that ensure that plans are acted upon. It's not just normal planning, it's not just coming up with any old plan, there's a very specific formulation that is needed to bring across these these very, very robust experimental effects. We describe it as strategic automaticity because it seems to mimic the effects of habit. And these effects of habit are increasing people's speed of responding, increasing information processing efficiency, and operating outside conscious awareness. And I'll give you a concrete example. Here's my walk to work. Okay? And as most people do, they head to work and say, most people are creatures of habit. The way you get to work most days is pretty much the same as the day before, as last week, as last year, 10 years ago, still doing the same thing. Now, if you're like me, occasionally you'll need to do something different. And if you're like me, then occasionally you'll pretty much forget and you'll have to do it on lunch break or when you go away from work. What implementation intentions do is overcome that automaticity. They overcome that silly thing. So the scenario is, I'm walking to work and I need to call into this shop. Okay? Well, ordinarily, what I would do, I would walk past the shop like I do 100 times every single day, and I need to go out at lunchtime to go to it. But if I form an implementation intention, I find that I'm much better at remembering. Now, implementation intentions are if-then plans. And my if-then plan in this case is, if I'm walking past a general store, then I will buy a plant pot. And actually this formulation looks incredibly straightforward, but it's incredibly important that it follows these strict guidelines. Because what happens is that by specifying this, if I'm walking past a general store, it makes the general store more salient in the environment. And we know this because there are dozens of laboratory studies that show that it does. If you do this in the laboratory, people's speed of responding, having identified a critical situation, is significantly faster than if you don't specify a critical situation. By attaching this critical situation to an appropriate response, this appropriate response of buying plant pots in this example springs to mind automatically. And again, we know this from laboratory research showing that cue response links are strengthened following formation of implementation intentions. So we know that implementation intentions work in the laboratory. They operate outside conscious awareness, and we know that they increase the salience of environmental stimuli and automatically link appropriate responses to them. So what I've been trying to do is take this work out of the laboratory. And so for the last part of the talk, I'm going to show some of the results that we've had by taking those implementation intention experimental studies out of the laboratory and into the real world. So one of the studies we did was in relation to getting people to quit smoking. Some call it addictive behaviour. It's habitual behaviour at the very least. Okay. So what happens if you don't give any people instructions to quit smoking? They carry on smoking. Why? Because people like to smoke. People give you all sorts of reasons about why they smoke, but fundamentally they kind of like to do it. If you do the common sense approach, which is to say, we want you to plan to quit smoking, and this is the advice that GPs should do, by the way, you get a 2% quit rate. This is about the same as getting advice from a GP to quit. So smokers go into the GP clinic, the GP says, why don't you quit, why don't you form a plan to quit? This is the kind of effect that you have. However, if you get people to form implementation intentions, these specific formulated plans based on the scientific evidence, you get a 19% quit rate. So you get these substantial effects controlling for this sort of generic planning kind of idea. So it's not just planning, it's a very, very specific formulation tried and tested in the laboratory. And we've replicated these effects in numerous populations across numerous different kinds of behaviour. So we've done it in relation to alcohol consumption. We're able to reduce alcohol consumption by approximately 2 units per day. This is one of our few students' studies, but we've managed to reduce students' binge drinking by about 5 units per week. Not a staggering amount, compared to some of our other effects. But there's a strong context to student binge drinking that has to be overcome as well as people's individual psychology. So we have these effects in binge drinking. We're able to boost people's physical activity using very similar techniques. This study is interesting because this was a study with low socioeconomic status people. This is, again, a group that are typically ignored by the standard sort of health promotion crowd, and we're able to significantly boost people's physical activity. This study was done among kids aged 6 to 10. So these are kids in school. Now, we didn't get them to write out plans, we didn't get them to form in any other way. We got the kids to chant along to a statement that was an if-then plan versus chanting along to something different. And what we found is we were able to significantly boost kids' physical activity. What I think this study shows is, firstly, it works in kids, which is fantastic. But secondly, that as long as the formulation is correct, the way in which it's delivered doesn't matter quite so much. So some of the studies I've been describing are kind of paper and pencil exercises. We've tried in all sorts of different kinds of formats. This is chanting along with a researcher, and we still have these kind of robust effects. So it seems to be very robust to change the format. This study was done among hospital workers. We were able to significantly reduce saturated fat intake. This study was in fruit intake, significantly able to boost fruit intake. Fruit intake again. This one, again, shift workers in hospitals. Really, really difficult population to deal with, kind of not chaotic lives, but sort of rotating shift patterns, very hard to get into an established routine, and with using implementation intentions, we're able to boost their fruit intake. Emotional eating, this was an online study that we actually did. Emotional eating is interesting because it underpins both obesity and anorexia and binge eating disorder as well. But we're able to reduce emotional eating. Emotional eating is all about eating automatically in response to mood states, usually negative mood states. What we're able to do is use the strategic automaticity of implementation intentions to overcome that impulse to eat in response to certain mood states. This is a study we did among people admitted for an index episode of self-harm. So these are people recruited from hospital who we got them to complete implementation intentions to overcome impulses to self-harm. 6 months later, significant reductions in suicidal ideation and behaviour. These are self-driven, self-completion, brief psychological interventions that are having a significant impact. And then the last one that I want to talk about is a study in weight management, because this is one of the groups where the oinker people. So the oinker people, they measure them. People are paying for it in the first place. They get goal setting. They get bombarded with information. We randomise them on top of all those behaviour change techniques to form implementation intentions or not, and we get a significant reduction in weight over and above everything else that's going on. Okay, this is paying for it. This is, and this is the argument why it's beyond motivation. We're doing something additional, and it shows that we have a robust technique that works, that we know the effects are attributable to that technique alone, as opposed to any of the other things that are going on, because everybody else gets the same treatment. Okay, so what are we working on next? Well, what we're working on next is to try and refine these kinds of plans. So what would be good would be if we could identify the content that works best for different people. And one idea that we're working on is using theory to populate the content of people's implementation intentions. So we've used the transitive reticle model, we've used self-determination theory, we've used self-incentive theory. So we're working on tweaking the content to get the best possible effect for people. In terms of administering implementation intentions, we've tried a load of different ways of administering it. We've got people to form their own plans completely. We've given people plans and told them to chant them aloud. The middle ground is we've given people the raw ingredients with which to form implementation intentions, and we found actually a few differences across these different means of getting them. As long as the formulation's right, that seems to work. But we need to do some work with different media. So we're working to develop an app, and we're developing online resources as well to be able to do this. Talked very briefly about mediating mechanisms, which are around queue accessibility and queue response links. One of the big challenges for us is measuring these kinds of things actually in the field. And again, I think mobile technology might be one of the things that we can use to try and measure things like accessibility and response links. But we haven't quite got there yet. Currently working with the MRC to develop an app that will help us do this. And then of course there are new domains. I've talked about emotional eating, alcohol consumption, but we're working with cleft palate kids, we're working in dentistry, we're working in multi-morbidity, a whole raft of different areas of work where we can extrapolate these findings. So, just to finish, I hope I managed to persuade you that changing behaviour is incredibly important. I'd go as far as to argue that it needs to be treated with the same respect as other medical interventions. If you develop a drug, it requires years and years of testing and licensing before you unleash it on the public. It turns out that you can just have a gang of people sat around coming up with stuff that will scare people, and that's perfectly fine to unleash on an unsuspecting public with, I wouldn't say devastating consequences, but adverse consequences nevertheless. I think we've got tools that demonstrably change people's behaviour that have incredibly high reach. I mean, you fling these out really at arm's length and incredibly low cost as well. And so you can imagine that if you put further resources into them, then because you've got this very basic technique, then the only way is up in terms of enhancement and increasing the effects. And maybe you can take away some of those other kinds of techniques that aren't working so well. And I think that our scientific approach is essential to meeting the current and future challenges in public health. Health behaviour isn't really going to go away. And even if health behaviour goes away, there'll be other behaviours that need to be changed as well. And I haven't got onto climate change or any of those other big policy questions, economic behaviour. But fundamentally, humans are at the root of a lot of these problems. And I hope you can see that these principles aren't simply just about health psychology. These principles underpin potentially all human behaviour. But for the moment, we'll focus on public health. Okay, are there any questions? Thank you.
I wonder with the self-affirmation studies, the participants accepted the message and derogated less. How threatening did they find it?
That's an interesting point. I mean, so I think in that particular study, I'm not sure we measured perceived threat, but one of the interesting problems we've come across is trying to make messages sufficiently scary. And what we find is that threat quite often moderates the effects. So that's the main effect that I showed you there. But the more threatened you feel by the message, the more effective is self-affirmation. But yeah, one of the problems that we're grappling with at the moment, and we're working in long-term conditions and trying to get people to adhere to medication. And one of the challenges we've got is trying to make the material threatening enough, because actually people are kind of blasé about this kind of thing.
And just another question. On the implementation effectively, is there any work looking at the potential effects of conscientiousness moderating?
Yeah. So we've done some stuff with conscientiousness. What's interesting with conscientiousness is we did one study in an educational setting, and we had this idea that conscientiousness would moderate the impact of implementation intentions. Sort of counterintuitively, but if you think about it intuitively, conscientiousness moderates it, but insofar as most conscientious people use implementation intentions anyway, or something akin to it. So conscientious people, it turns out, are pretty conscientious, and so don't need this kind of intervention. People low in conscientiousness actually benefited much greatly from this kind of technique. So yeah, there's an interesting moderator effect there. So if you can target this at people low in conscientiousness, you get a huge boost to behaviour change.
Staying with the studies on self-affirmation, presumably you deliver the questionnaire and you deliver the warning as well.
Mm-hmm.
If the participants are aware that you're behind both things, I mean, does it matter that there's this association with your team and the warnings and the leaflets? So were the two things to be separate, or the leaflets are just turn up there and you come in and you deliver this self-affirmation? is the affirmation alone enough to make me more likely to change my behaviour, or do I have to associate it with the organisation who are sort of delivering these warnings and delivering guidance?
So, I mean, we do try and keep it as arm's length as possible, but the self-affirmation bit and the risk information appear in the same session. Is that what you mean?
I guess that's what I'm asking, yeah.
Yeah, and so what would happen if you had a self-affirmation session and then,
Because
why don't you come and do these other experiments?
Your experimental participants just associate this pleasant thing that you've delivered to them with you, and these leaflets that are available, which are your dependent variable, with you as well. They're more likely to be drawn towards those for a reason other than self-affirmation, you see what I mean? Whereas the control participants don't have that sort of positive and effective response to you, or in that case, to your leaflets.
So you're saying that self-affirmation makes them more positive towards us as well as the information?
Well, therefore, and the information, because the information is associated with you. You see what I mean?
Both groups get the same information.
But both groups don't get the same. So the self-affirmation may be acting as a conditioning, as it were. So if I have this positive experience of feeling affirmed because I've completed this questionnaire, and I associate it with you as an experimenter, or I have a neutral experience, so I don't have any positive association with you as an experimenter, and then I know that your research team have placed this guidance here that I can go to, am I more likely to go to it just because I've had that positive experience and not because affirmation is sort of filling this hole, this sort of reducing this sort of fearful aspect? Can you tease the two things apart, I guess is what I'm asking.
So, do you mean like literally me stood there?
Well, so what I mean is, imagine I'm the government and I deliver a health warning, and you are a participant. If you come along with something, and if somebody else completely different comes along and delivers this sort of self-affirming questionnaire, does that have the same effect on the government, on my take-up of government guidance and my response to that warning, despite the fact I don't associate the self-affirmation and the people delivering the guidance?
Okay, sorry, I get what you mean now.
Okay.
So we've tried this, and we've tried to manipulate the perceived source of the message. Is this what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. We've tried to manipulate the perceived source of the message, and it didn't seem to have any effect.
So you get the same pattern of data?
Yeah, get the same pattern. It didn't matter whether it seemed to come from the 4 chief medical officers for the UK, as opposed to no attribution on it at all.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's a possibility. We've only done it in one study, but given that we're getting effects on serum phosphate a year down the line, I don't know.
But I guess the question in terms of implementing it in the real world will be, if there is some way of implementing this on a large scale, does the self-affirmation have to be delivered by the same organisation as they're delivering the warnings? Is that going to be important? I guess, is that going to be possible?
Well, I don't know, and I think it'd be worthwhile following up.
So, well, I'm just interested to know, would you be able to give an example of what did the statement to use? So with the children sitting in chant in particular, then statement, do you remember what it was?
Yeah. So the kids one was, if it's playtime, then I'll run around lots of it. No, it wasn't run around lots, but I think it was something like I'll run around lots or something like that. And the control condition just said something along the lines of I'll run around lots or something like that. Okay. But we specifically tied it to playtime. It was definitely playtime, and the second bit escapes me at the minute. Yeah.
Chris, I wondered what your thoughts were regarding self-affirmation. Do you think it might somehow fit into the trans-theoretical model? For example, self-affirmation perhaps be mediated by the experiential motivational components of the model, like self-evaluation, for example.
I think you're right. I think it could prompt self-re-evaluation, and that would be the part of the trans-theoretical model that I'd be looking at, I think. The other part that I'd be looking at is that it should work better in the earlier stages of change than in the later stages of change. So I'd anticipate that it would be less effective in the later stages of change. But I mean, we haven't really done any of that work yet. But yes, I think there are some interesting hypotheses to pursue there.
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting thought. I suppose what I wondered is, what if you're doing anything at the moment to make people want to use implementation intentions outside of the study? So we've done a similar thing. We've made an app, and we love this app, and it looks really nice. But the worry, of course, is that people come into the study, they use the app because they've been told to use the app, and it's a behavioural change tool that works. I mean, I'm really convinced by implementation intentions and the fact they work, but when you leave and you're not participant in that study, then why, I don't know, do people want to do implementation intentions when you're not there telling them it's part of the study? And I suppose that's maybe what the app's for, but are you thinking about how to do that?
I think there are two issues here. One is the sort of longevity of the effects, and the effects we know last up to 5 years.
Yeah.
So I don't have any problems with longevity there. There's another issue to do with apps and the like, which is around, so I'm not sure I should share this, but there is a study that someone wants to do maybe about, with everybody wants to do stuff with apps, and there's a million physical activity apps, okay? My question is, how on earth do you get people to download it and use it? And so I think implementation intentions to use apps is probably something that we really need to look into, because there are some great apps there. I've looked at them. You know, I looked at a smoking one the other day. I set my quit date to my 4,000th birthday. I mean, you know, there's a lot of ingenuity. You know, it's really easy to do and things like that. But the problem is getting people to download them and actually use them properly. So I think there's like a meta behaviour change sort of issue. And that relates to sort of the third thing I want to say, which is around, well, what happens if you train people to use implementation intentions and say, don't just form implementation intentions. Look, this is the theory behind them, this is how it works, this is how it can work for you. You know, in areas of your life, why don't you use that? I think that's a potentially interesting way of going. And it relates back to the comment about conscientiousness. We suspect that people who are conscientious kind of do this kind of thing anyway, and so maybe there's a sort of 2/3 of people who would benefit, but there's a kind of, you know, you get motivational interviewing. One of the things that we're working on is towards work in progress volitional interviewing, whereby rather than trying to boost people's motivation and point out discrepancies, it's about structuring them and their lives around changes that they already know that they want to make and know how to do it. Does that address your comment?
Yeah.
So, I have a problem with change behaviour because it just seems to me so very obvious. You want to change someone's behaviour. You give it some sort of grandiose meaning like change behaviour. I mean, priory clinics are trying to change people's behaviour. You have an kind of a good success rate with all your publications. What's your failure rate like? How does the techniques that you're working on actually work in the real world as in addiction? I like to look at the world in reward and punishment, dopamine systems, and it's the world I understand, and how impossible it is for these people to basically change their behaviour because they're addicted to those things. So sitting there and giving them some, mnemonic, and say I'm all right today, ain't going to work. So within which bandwidth is this stuff actually doing anything, and where does it begin to fail, in terms of the real critical significance of people ignoring all the health warnings? They're so locked into the addictive property, and that again gets into population segmentation. We're not all the same. Yeah? Some people deal with these things, give up the pain of that problem, others never do it. So how do you segment populations, and where do you see the limitations in implementation theory or whatever else in its integrity aspect?
Yeah, I mean, I hope I made it clear I wasn't talking about addicted populations by any way, shape or form. I mean, these are regular, free-range smokers, drinkers, people at no extreme end of the continuum. We've done a study recently where we're able to get smokers to reduce their alcohol consumption
Smokers to stop drinking.
Yeah, to lower alcohol consumption. And precisely because of those brain reward mechanisms. So that's as far as we've got with that. But yes, I mean, I think that would be another area for future research. But yes, so we get smokers to reduce their alcohol consumption. It's obviously quite closely linked to the similar reward mechanism of hitting it. But yeah, I mean, you deal with general populations rather than clinical ones.
Punishment works so well as a way of limiting behaviour. The reason I don't drive down the motorway at 180 miles an hour is the threat of losing my licence. If it was a great way to look at punishment as reward in terms of regulating behaviour. It's interesting these punishments don't work in terms of, the visual imagery, nothing. People are immune. It doesn't. It's the recidivism, I suppose. Ain't never going to learn.
Yeah. I mean, we have got plans to work with those kinds of population. Just haven't done it yet. I mean, these are proof of concept studies that might or might not work in those kinds of populations.
There's no lot of success here. It's banking with these behavioural, these food deals, getting children to eat vegetables. Actually, it's even set up a business now. Is that a different behaviour, sort of? Is that different to what you're doing in terms of?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I would say the commonalities.
Peer pressure and kids are quite malleable, aren't they?
So some are. Yeah. I mean, I'm going out on a limb here slightly, but I'd say the similarities among the behaviours are greater than the differences between them, and that the principles that seem to work for each of the behaviours talked about today seem to translate across pretty well, albeit with non-clinical populations.
Just one final comment, it comes from the M25 yesterday because this guy's at covering his bicycle onto the M25. I've come across a similar thing with my sat nav. It'll tell me to turn left, and I'll go left. It's in a one-way street. There's something about the app and the way that it dictates behaviour, which I'd really like to look into, because you just believe them. The app said, I wasn't not turning, the app said M25.
Well, it's automaticity again.
But that's exactly it.
And I think the broader argument is around nudging automaticity. I don't like the word nudge, but dealing with automaticity and implementation intention are one way of dealing with automaticity. And one of the things that we're looking at is restructuring environments as a way of disrupting behavioural routines. And I think implementation intention is one way of doing it. Following the stuff with smokers reducing their alcohol consumption, I'm optimistic that there's a role for it. But it's not the full story. I mean, the quit rate was not 100% among the smokers. There's scope for other approaches as well. But it's an approach. But I mean, you're right. I mean, smokers say, I smoke because I'm stressed, because I'm happy. They smoke because of nicotine.
Fear the addict of the story.
Yeah. But I'm optimistic that these approaches have a role to play in those clinical populations, but not by any means the full story.
Right, thank you very much.
I think we've possibly got time for one more very quick question if anybody's got one.
You were saying that it could work in things like suicide behaviours and reducing suicide behaviours and reducing things like emotional eating. People with anorexia or stuff. Could you say it could be used in any other type of mental disorder? So, for example, in OCD, like reducing compulsive behaviours.
I think it'd be worth a go. I mean, we've done some work on the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, and it was only a very small scale study, so it's more about the acceptability of it to patients rather than trying to find an effect. But we did have some sort of promising kinds of findings. So yeah, I mean, I'd say it's worth a go. It's just we haven't got around to it yet, but I think there's potential there. But again, I think it's not going to be the full story.
Well, thanks very much, Chris. Very interesting talk. Obviously, lots to talk about, so I think we'll call it for now, but if anybody does want to talk about this, we're going to nip over to the ship and mitre for a quick drink, so if anybody wants to come along, you're more than welcome. Okay.